Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua, with Dr. Daniel Cantey. As the modern order enters its apparent sunset, Dr. Cantey looks anew at the ancient scriptures to learn what they teach about man and his world. Here he is with today's episode.
Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to this episode of the Old Testament and the New Man. I'm your instructor, Daniel Cantey. And tonight we're going to be continuing on with the patriarchal story within the broader story of the creation of the people of Israel. Now, you may recall that as we move through this broader story of Israel's creation, we'll do it in two phases. The first of these phases is the patriarchal story, or the patriarchal narrative, which deals with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. And here we're talking about the people of Israel as a family, a small at the beginning and larger family by the end. The second half of our story, the larger part of the story of the creation of Israel, is the national narrative, where we deal with Israel as a nation, as several 100,000 people, if not more, as opposed to just being a large family. So here we are in Genesis, having finished with Abraham, and tonight we're going to go over Isaac and Jacob. We'll spend the lesser part of the lesson on Isaac and the greater part on Jacob. As we move through this particular lesson, I want us to bear in mind the question of what it is to be a new man. What example do the Old Testament fathers give us? What do the Old Testament heroes show us that is relevant to us now about what it means to be new creatures, even men who are living through the apparent end of the liberal order, who see its fraying around us on a regular basis? How are we to strive to know God? Even if our society is teetering in various ways, the question does not change. How is it that we are to know God? And the path that is given to us does not change. We're going to see that here in just a moment with the story of Isaac. But here what we are thinking is, how is it that we are to be Christians in general and also in the time that is before us in which we live? So we're going to start with the story of Isaac. And in this particular portion of the story, Abraham has sent his servant to his family, to his place of origin, to find a wife for Isaac. So the servant goes and she finds Rebekah, and she brings Rebekah back to Isaac. What I want to emphasize here is what Isaac is doing when the servant and Rebekah return, because we're really not told that much about Isaac. We know that he's almost sacrificed by Abraham at the beginning, and there's another story that we're going to see with him in a few moments. But other than these few stories, we really don't have a whole lot of information about him. So what is it that he is doing when the servant returns? Chapter 24, verses 62 and 63 of Genesis. Now Isaac came through the desert to the well of the vision, for he dwelt in the south. Isaac then went out to meditate in the field in the evening, and he lifted his eyes and saw camels coming. And seeing the camels, that's Rebekah and the servant coming to him. But what I want to emphasize here is that he goes to the well of the vision. This is a place where the angel appeared to Hagar to tell her to go back to Abraham and Sarah. So Isaac goes out to spend his time in a location where the divine has revealed itself, where the word of God came to Hagar for what she should do. God had been present there. That's where Isaac goes. The second point that I want to make is that he is meditating in that location. He goes there to open himself to the divine by concentrating on divine things. Putting aside worldly cares, putting aside distractions, he goes to the place where the Spirit of God has been so that he can then open himself to that Spirit, so that he can then orient himself to those things that are eternal. This is something that was happening in Isaac's life some thousands of years ago, whenever Isaac may have lived somewhere in the second millennium BC. This was his practice. Go in the evening, meditate on God in the place where God has revealed his will. And you might think to yourself, well, that's something that happened several thousand years ago. But we in the Orthodox Church know that this tradition of meditation and concentration on the divine presence has not changed. since the time of Isaac all the way to the last century. And at this point, I want to quote from St. Joseph the Hesychast, a saint of the last century, who was asked how it is that people in the world, those who are not monks, how it is that we are supposed to seek God. And he says, well, read the scripture every day. And he says also that you should go to confession often. And then he talks about prayer. Don't neglect prayer, St. Joseph says. Practice especially mental prayer, prayer of the heart, saying, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon me. This is the most important form of spiritual work. Then he's asked, how do you practice this in the world in the midst of so many cares and distractions? And here's what he says. Set aside an hour each day, preferably in the evening before going to bed, and practice the prayer continuously during that time. Of all forms of prayer, he adds, this is the safest and best, provided it is combined with inner attention so that the mind does not wander off and that one follows the instructions of an experienced spiritual guide. In other words, under the guidance of your priest or spiritual father, take your time, preferably in the evening, in order to practice the presence of God. We have something that is very close, if not the same, here in the 20th century to what St. Isaac was doing so many hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. Take your time, open yourself to the presence of God, practice inner attention under the guidance of someone who is a spiritual superior, then seek God inwardly. Go to meditate, go to pray, be in the presence of God. This particular aspect of what it is to be a Christian has not changed from the ancient times into the modern times. Despite the invention of radios and automobiles and the internet, the way towards God has not changed. Set aside worldly cares. Find the place where God has revealed himself, if you are Isaac. Be there and open yourself to the presence of God. Whether you are Isaac in ancient Israel or whether you are St. Joseph talking to those in the modern world, in the modern West today, how is it that you seek God? It is in stillness, in a certain amount of separation from the world to focus the mind on divine things and to seek the peace of God in his presence. This is the example that we are given in the Old Testament, an example that has continued to us even now. When we think about what it is to be new men, to be a new man in our circumstances, is to say God is still to be sought in the midst of what these circumstances are. No matter how bad things may seem out there in the world, the inner path is still there, and it is still commended to us inasmuch as we are able to practice it, inasmuch as God has granted us the time and the concentration, the ability to do this under proper spiritual guidance. Continuing on with the story, we're told that after the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt at the well of the vision. So he lives where he prays. It's not just a place he goes every so often in order to try to find God, but it is where he makes his living, where he stays. Now we're told this about Isaac. We'll come back to him in just a moment. But for now, the story of Jacob and Esau is brought to us. It is introduced to us. Now Rebekah is barren for some time, and so as a result, Isaac pleads with the Lord that she would have children, and God answers, and she conceives. She conceives twins, but the twins struggle against one another in her womb. And she says to herself, if I am well, if all is well, rather, why am I like this? And as a result, the Lord gives her this prophecy about the children that she is to bear. 2 nations are in your womb, she is told, and 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. One shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And when they are born, the firstborn comes out red, and he was like a hairy garment all over, and so they named him Esau. Then the second comes out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and so they called him Jacob. These are the 2, And it is said, the older shall serve the younger. Jacob is the chosen one, Esau is not. And this raises a question for us, a question that I should very briefly mention. We're not going to spend a lot of time or get sidetracked on it. That is the question of election. Why it is that God chooses one person and not another, or why he chooses one people and not another. As we are told, Esau is the father of the people of Edom, the Edomites. Jacob is going to be the father of the Israelites and have the name Israel, as we'll see a little bit later in the story. But St. Paul treats this question of election with particular concern for Jacob and Esau. This is chapter 9, verses 10 through 13 of Romans. And not only this, St. Paul writes, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one man, even by our father Isaac, for the children not yet being born, nor having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him who calls, it was said to her, the older shall serve the younger. This is a quote from the promise that we just read. As it is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. So why is it that God chooses one person and not another? What does God see in Jacob that he doesn't see in Esau is really a better way to phrase the question. Neither one of them have done anything that makes them worthy of receiving God's choice or God's election. So what is it that God sees if he doesn't see concrete particular actions? Well, St. John Chrysostom tells us he sees the disposition. He sees whether or not our character has the capacity to seek him. So he chooses not in utter arbitrariness, not just blindly picking one and not the other, but seeing the orientation of the person, the disposition of the person. And for further comment on this, I recommend that you take a look at St. John Chrysostom's commentary on Romans. This kind of argument or understanding and interpretation of the passage is laid out there. But what I want to emphasize here is that with this prophecy that the older shall serve the younger, and with God's favoritism for Jacob, we see God's hand over everything that follows with Jacob. His is a life under divine care, under divine direction, under divine guidance. It's similar in a way to Abraham receiving the blessing of Melchizedek, where the eternal and spiritual reality comes down to bless the temporal. And this isn't exactly a blessing, but it is something that reveals to us the divine overwatching for what is going to happen to Jacob and all the story that follows. Moving on with that story. So the boys grew. Now Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a simple man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And one day Esau went to the field, and when he came in, he was weary. So Esau said to Jacob, who was cooking, "Let me taste this red stew, for I am exhausted." But Jacob said to Esau, "Sell me your birthright today." And Esau replied, "Look, I am about to die. What good then is this birthright to me?" And then Jacob said, "Swear to it. Swear to me today." So Esau swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. This is the key failure on Esau's part. To have the birthright is to be the bearer of the faith of God, the faith of Isaac. Esau says, "No, I don't care as much for that as I care for my physical necessities, as I care for being able to get a meal right now." And so he trades what is eternal. He trades what is unending and undying for something temporal. He takes what is higher and makes it lower. He takes the lower and makes it higher. And in so doing, he rejects the spiritual inheritance from God that he was to receive. All that follows for Esau, what happens a little bit later when he misses his blessing, is a result of what happens here. Esau has in fact set that in motion. He has drawn it down upon himself as a consequence. We see this similar idea in other places in the Old Testament, particularly in kingdoms, where people sin and then they draw consequences of that sin, and they are deceived in those consequences. We'll get to that in a few moments. But here Esau has set his own downfall in motion by his own action. Now, before we get to the story of the blessing of Jacob over Esau and the deception that happens there, before we get to that, There's a story of Isaac and Abimelech. This is chapter 26 of Genesis. Now there was a famine in the land besides the first famine in the days of Abraham. And so Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines in Gerar. This is southwestern Israel. If you look at the map of the modern state of Israel, it's approximately the land of the Gaza Strip, southwestern Israel. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I will tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your seed I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your seed multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give your seed all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham your father obeyed my voice and kept my charge." So what we see here is a repetition of the covenant promises given to Abraham, the promise of offspring, the promise of land, the promise of blessing. In this case, in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. But what is added here that is of note is this promise of God, "I will be with you." This particular phrase, "I will be with you," we will see repeated in one or another instance through the stories of Isaac and Jacob. This is not a phrase that we saw in the story of Abraham, but we see it now. We see it for Isaac, and a little bit later we will see it for Jacob. Now the men of the place asked about his wife, about Isaac's wife, and he says, "She is my sister because she's beautiful," and he's afraid that they're going to kill him and take Rebekah. So he tells them that she is his sister. Now when it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of Gerar, looked through the window and saw Isaac and Rebekah being fond with each other, as people who love each other will, showing endearment to Rebekah, his wife, the text says. Then Abimelech calls Isaac to him, and he says, "Quite obviously, this is your wife. Why did you say she is my sister?" And he said, "I didn't want to die on account of her." And Abimelech says back to him, "Why have you done this to us? One of the people could easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, "He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." And so now Isaac and Rebekah are protected from any kind of ill will or bad action on the part of the people. So Isaac sows in the land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. And Isaac becomes very prosperous, very wealthy, so much so that Abimelech says to him, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we." And Isaac departs from there and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar. So he goes away a little bit from the Philistines, but he's still in the same region of Gerar. At this point, he has various skirmishes with the people in the area, various disagreements over access to wells and water. Twice he thinks he has a well dug, and then there's an argument with the herdsmen of Gerar saying the water is ours. And so he is pushed away from these wells, and this is problematic. If you're going to live and if you're going to feed your flocks, you have to have water. Verse 23 of chapter 26, "Then Isaac went up from there to the well of Oath, and the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, 'I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you.'" Again, this phrase, "I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your seed for my servant Abraham's sake." So Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. And this time, after God has made his promise to him, they are able to stay there with the well and have water. In fact, Abimelech comes to Isaac and says, "We have certainly seen that the Lord is with you. So we said, let there now be an oath between you and us." And there is now peace between Isaac and Abimelech and the men of the region at this time. So there's a bit of a threat that Isaac has to go through with whether or not he will be able to have water. But God says to him again, "I am with you." And immediately after this, those who had pushed him out come to him and say, "We see that God is with you. Let's make an oath. Let's be at peace with one another." After this interlude where we see that God is certainly with Isaac, we return to the story of Jacob and Esau. So Isaac at this point is old, and his eyes are not working very properly, so he can't see terribly well. So he calls Esau to him, and he says, "My son." And Esau says, "Here I am." Isaac then says, "Behold, now I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Therefore take your weapons, your quiver, and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Then make me savory food such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die." And Rebekah hears this, that Isaac is about to bless Esau, and she doesn't want it to happen. So she calls Jacob to her, and she says, "Go now to the sheep and bring me from there 2 kids, choice and good, and I will make savory food from them as your father loves. And then you shall take it to your father, that he may eat it and bless you before his death." So she is the one who comes to Jacob and says, "Here's how you are going to get the blessing," rather than Esau. But Jacob says to Rebekah, his mother, "Look, Esau, my brother, is a hairy man, and I am a smooth-skinned man. So what if Isaac were to feel me? What if my father were to feel me? What then will happen? He would certainly know that it's me and not Esau." So at this point, Rebekah took choice clothes of her elder son Esau, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. She also put the skins of the kids on his hands and on the exposed part of his neck. Then she gave to Jacob the savory food and the bread that she had prepared, and she put them into the hands of her son. So Jacob goes to Isaac, pretending that he is Esau. And Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done just as you told me. Arise, sit, and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me." And Isaac is a bit surprised. He says, "You've gotten back here quickly. How is it that you killed something this quickly and cooked it? Not that much time has passed." And Jacob says, very shrewdly, "The Lord blessed me while I was out hunting, so I was able to find something quickly." Still, Isaac thinks to himself, the voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau's when he touches the hands and the arms. Thus Isaac did not recognize Jacob because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands, and so he blessed him. And he said, "Are you my son Esau?" And Jacob said, "I am." Then Isaac blesses Jacob, and he says, "Surely the smell of my son is like the smell of a field the Lord has blessed. Therefore may God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. And cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you." This is the blessing that Jacob gives to his son, that Isaac gives, rather, to his son Jacob. Now, as soon as Isaac finished blessing Jacob his son, Esau comes in from his hunting. And he also had made savory food, and he brought it to his father. And he said, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that your soul may bless me." And his father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" So he said, "I am Esau, your firstborn." Then Isaac trembled exceedingly. And he says to Esau, "Who? Where is the one who hunted game and brought it to me? I ate all of it before you came, and I have blessed him, and indeed he shall be blessed." And when Esau hears the words of his father, he cries out bitterly, "Bless me, me also, O my father. Have you only one blessing, my father? Bless me, me also, my father." And he is in anguish because of what has been taken from him. But what has been taken from him as a consequence of his own action, of his own disposition. He may or may not see that himself. At this point, he is just feeling the pain of what he has lost. But again, this is the consequence of actions that he himself has taken. They are events that he himself has set in motion. And so Isaac gives Esau a blessing. "Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth and of the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass, when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke from your neck." So things are going to go well for him. Your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth, and yet he shall serve his brother. I want to make a side note about, make a point on the side about this. It shall come to pass when you become restless that you shall break his yoke from your neck. If you were going to ask a question about revolution or about rebellion in the Old Testament, when does it happen? Why does it happen? Here you have a very brief summary of why it happens. When you become restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. People do not rebel in the Old Testament because they don't have freedom. They rebel because they don't have rest. They don't go into revolt because they think that they should be free. They go into revolt because they are restless. Because, in other words, their burdens are too much for them to bear. That is why they go into revolt. We see this in various places, for example, in Kings, with the story of Jeroboam and Rehoboam. I want to add here a little bit about the notion of deception on Jacob's part in order to get the blessing from Isaac. In the book of 3 Kingdoms, King Ahab sins. He has Naboth murdered and he takes his vineyard. He does this together with his queen Jezebel. And he faces a penalty for this. He is to die. But here is how his death comes about. There's a question of whether he should go to war with another kingdom, and all of his prophets tell him that he should go. And so he calls Micaiah ben Imlah, another prophet who doesn't say favorable things generally to him, to King Ahab, and he says, "What do you have to say about whether or not I should go to war?" And Micaiah says this, Micaiah the prophet, "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne and all the host of heaven standing by on his right hand and on his left. Then the Lord said, 'Who will deceive Ahab the king of Israel, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?'" In other words, God is saying it is now the time for Ahab to reap what he has sown with his sin. Who will go and deceive him so that he will reap what he has sown? One spoke one way and another spoke in another way. Then a spirit came forth and stood before the Lord and said, "I will deceive him." And the Lord said to him, "In what way?" So he said, "I will go out and be a deceiving spirit in the mouth of all these prophets." And the Lord said, "You shall deceive him, and you shall prevail. Go and do so." Now behold, the Lord put a lying spirit in the mouth of all those prophets of yours. So the Lord has spoken evil things against you. This is what Micaiah says to Ahab. Now, to put all this in the context of the wisdom tradition, pride comes before destruction. When you raise yourself up, you will fall. When you break God's commandments, when you disavow faith in him, and when you decide to live in pride in any number of the ways that one can live in pride, one sets in motion a course of events that lead to destruction. Often in the Old Testament, that destruction happens because one is deceived. And so the deception is, as it were, sanctioned by the person who commits the sin because the destruction is coming to them. There's a certain law of the universe, kind of moral law, if you will, that we see in places. And this is how we see it work at times in the Old Testament. When you raise yourself up, you will fall. And the fall very often means that you are deceived about something. That deception or trickery comes into play. So back to the story of Esau and Jacob. When Esau learns that his blessing has been taken from him, he says, "Let the days of mourning for my father draw near, then I will kill my brother Jacob." But Rebekah hears about it, and so she calls Jacob, and she says, "It is time for you to flee to Mesopotamia to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay with him there until your brother's anger and wrath turn away from you." And at this point, Jacob says, yes, he's going to do this. Isaac calls him and blesses him before he goes. And Isaac says to him, "Go to Mesopotamia to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take for yourself a wife there from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God bless you and increase you and multiply you, that you may be an assembly of nations." And so he leaves. He flees what was his homeland with his family because he fears for his life at the hand of his brother. whose blessing he has taken. It's at this point, on the way to Mesopotamia, that Jacob has the dream of the ladder. Jacob went out from the well of Oath and went toward Haran. So he came to a certain place and stayed there all night because the sun had set. Then he took one of the stones of that place and put it at his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to heaven. And there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. So behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. Do not fear. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your seed, and also your seed shall be as the dust of the earth. And in you and in your seed all the tribes of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you, God says to Jacob, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. So there is the promise of land and the promise of offspring, a promise of blessing. In you all the tribes of the earth shall be blessed. These promises, it seems, are out in the future. They're not going to happen in Jacob's lifetime. Then there is a promise for Jacob's lifetime, for now. I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. Thus God says to Jacob while he is going away, while he is fleeing for his life. Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, the Lord was in this place, and I did not know it. This is none other than the house of God. And so he took the stone that he had put at his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on it. And Jacob also makes a vow to God as a response to his dream. If the Lord God will be with me and keep me in this way I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, then the Lord shall be my God. If he shall bring me back in safety to my father's house, he shall be my God. And this stone I set as a pillar shall be God's house to me. And of all you give me, I will surely give a tithe to you. So God has made promises to Jacob, and Jacob makes a vow back to God. Now Jacob goes to Laban's house, and Laban and Jacob agree that Jacob will work among Laban's flocks. And Jacob is asked, what will be your wages? Now Jacob has seen Laban's daughter Rachel, and he loves her. And so he says, I will work 7 years for the hand of Rachel, your daughter. And so Laban says, it is better that I give her to you than to any other man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. Then they gather for the wedding feast. And it came to pass in the evening that Laban took Leah, his other daughter, his older daughter, and brought her to Jacob, and he goes into Leah rather than to Rachel. And when he wakes in the morning, and Jacob sees what he has done, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me? And Laban replied, it must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week, which is to say another 7 years. And I will give you this one also. I will give you Rachel as well, for the service you will render me for still another 7 years. And so Jacob agrees. He works another 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, he marries Rachel. After those 7 years, he works another 7 years. He served with Laban still another 7 years after having both wives. And so the total, adding up the 7 years, would come to 21 years, assuming that he stays the entire time. We'll see he's just a little bit shorter than that. The next part of the story deals with Jacob's children through his wives and through their maids. He's married to Rachel and to Leah. He has children through them. He also has children through Zilpah and Bilhah, their maids. There's an interesting quote in the middle of this story of the birth of the children. Leah at first was the one who was able to have children, and Rachel wasn't. So Rachel prays to God, and then God grants her children, and she says, God has helped me, and I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. And this language of wrestling with my sister and prevailing foreshadows what we're going to see when Jacob wrestles with God. a little bit later on in the story. And at this point, 11 of the 12 children are born over the 7 years, over the 14 years or so, really, between the marriage to Leah and when Jacob will eventually leave Laban. There's a bit of a dispute over wages for the last 7 years that Jacob works for Laban. Laban and Jacob are talking, and Laban says to him, "Name me your wages, and I will give it." And Jacob replied, "You know how I have served you, and how numerous your cattle became with me. The Lord has blessed you since my coming. Now therefore, when shall I also establish my own house?" And Laban says to him, "What shall I give you?" So Jacob replies, "Let me pass through all your flocks today, removing from them all the gray sheep and all the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages." So it depends on the color of the animal. And if the animals are of a particular color, then Jacob will be able to take those as his own. So Laban says to him, "Let it be according to your word." But that day, we are told, Laban removed all the male goats that were speckled and spotted, and all the females that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the gray ones among the sheep, and gave them into the hands of his sons. Then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. So in other words, they agree that Jacob will have all of the animals, all the sheep and the goats of a particular color. Laban says, "Yeah, that's fine." And then Laban tells his sons, "Take all of the ones of that color and go away with them." So Laban is doing something very underhanded to Jacob. He does not mean to pay him. Now, he's already deceived him by giving him Leah instead of Rachel, which was not the original agreement, as Jacob understood it, at least. And now he's also being crafty when it comes to the wages for Jacob for his labor with the flocks. So what does Jacob do? He took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees, peeled white strips in them, tearing off the bark, and tore white strips in them, tearing off the bark. So the white strips he had peeled appeared on the rods as spotted. And he puts these in the troughs where the animals go for watering. And when the flocks conceived before the rods, the flocks brought forth speckled, spotted, and ash-colored speckled offspring. So thus it came to pass, whenever the sheep conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the sheep in the gutters so they might conceive according to the rods. So in other words, there is some sort of miracle here where when the animals conceive before these rods that have a particular coloring to them, they have offspring that are according to the coloring. And that coloring is the kind that would belong to Jacob. And in this way, the man became exceedingly rich and had many cattle and oxen, male and female servants, and camels and donkeys. So over the course of several years, this last 7 years, Jacob has more and more prosperity. More and more of the flocks become his, until near the end of those 7 years, Laban's sons say to themselves, "Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from our father's property he acquired all this wealth." So Jacob saw Laban's countenance, and indeed it was not favorable toward him as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Return to your father's land and to your family, and I will be with you." This again is the promise. I will be with you. It has been 20 years. All of this time that Jacob has worked for Laban and received his wages through some amount of deception and has to get around the way that Laban has treated him. And now God says, it's time to go back. It's time to go back ultimately to face your brother. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field where the flocks were. And this is what he says to them. "I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable toward me as before, but the God of my father has been with me. Now you know that with all my might I served your father, yet your father deceived me and changed my wages 10 times with respect to the male lambs. But God did not allow him to harm me." And this phrase that God changed my wages 10 times is probably an idiomatic expression. It probably just means that he treated me unjustly and he deceived me, that he was unfair to me. God tells Jacob, "I have seen everything Laban is doing to you. I am the God who appeared to you at Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and made a vow to me. Now then arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your nativity, and I will be with you." Jacob says this to his wives, Rachel and Leah, that God has seen this and has now told him to go. And so Rachel and Leah agree, and they say, "It's time for us to go back." Now when Laban hears of this, he took all his brethren with him, and he pursued 7 days' journey. And he overtook, in other words, he caught up with Jacob in the mountains of Gilead. But God, the scriptures tell us, had come to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said to him, "Be careful that you do not speak evil things to Jacob at any time." So God has acted to protect Jacob from Laban. And when they meet, when Laban comes to Jacob, Laban says, "It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, 'Be careful that you do not speak evil things to Jacob at any time.'" So in other words, Laban recognizes that God is protecting Jacob, and he refuses to do anything to Jacob as a result of it. He resists the temptation. Jacob says this to Laban, "These 20 years I have been with you. Your sheep and your female goats have not miscarried their young, and I have not eaten the rams of your flock. In the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. Thus I have been in your house 20 years. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock. And you have changed my wages 10 times with respect to the female lambs. Unless the God of my father Abraham and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. But God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night." Jacob understands that Laban is a threat, that Laban would certainly treat him unjustly and do him wrong if he had the opportunity. But it is God who was with Jacob and who protects him. As Jacob himself says it, "God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands." He saw my suffering and he saw my work. He saw, in other words, that Jacob had worked as well as he could with all of his might and had done no wrong to Laban, while Laban was the one who had wronged Jacob. And here at his moment of vulnerability, as he is fleeing away, when Laban comes to do who knows what to Jacob, God says to Laban, "You will not. You will speak no evil towards him, and by implication, you will lay no hand on him." So Laban answers and says, "Come, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me." And Jacob says, "Look, there is no one with us. God himself is witness between you and me." And so they make an agreement, and they ate and drank. And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, and he offered a sacrifice on the mountain and called his brethren. And they ate and drank and stayed all night on the mountain. So this first challenge is overcome. Jacob is saved by God's direct intervention from the threat of Laban. But he's not done with threats. At this point, he goes towards the promised land, back to where he came from, to the land that God said he was going to bring him back to. But when he gets there, he must meet Esau, and he must deal with whatever ill will he thinks Esau still has for him. So Jacob went his way, and he saw the hosts of God encamped. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's encampment." And he called the name of that place encampments. In other words, while he's on the way to the promised land, he actually sees the hosts of angels. And remember, God has said to Jacob, "I will be with you." Here we have a spiritual reality shown to Jacob that God is present with him, that as he travels on his way, he is not alone. The hosts of the angels move with him. This is a preparation for what he's about to encounter, what he's about to hear. Because he commands his servants to go forward to Esau and say, "Thus your servant Jacob says, I sojourned with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen, donkeys, and sheep, and male and female servants. I have sent to tell my Lord that I may find grace in your sight. So in other words, after he sees all of these hosts of angels and he's progressing towards Esau, he sends his servants ahead to tell Esau that he is coming. And when they come back to him, the servants say, we came to your brother Esau, and he is also coming to meet you, and 400 men with him. So Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. So here's the counter evidence that he has to face. On the one hand, there is the spiritual reality of the hosts of God that he has seen, who are traveling with him, who are there beside him on the road, as it were. And then there's the physical reality of Esau coming with 400 men. And it seems that the angels would be there to protect him. God has said that he will be with Jacob, and so his hosts are there. But there is also the threat. There is also what appears to Jacob as the coming of death, as Esau who comes for vengeance, Esau who wishes him dead. So Jacob prays. This is chapter 32, verse 9. Jacob says, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to the land of your nativity, and I will deal well with you. Let me be satisfied with all the righteousness and all the truth you have shown your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two companies. Deliver me from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid of him, lest he come and attack me, and the mother with the children. For you said, I will surely treat you well, and make your seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So Jacob says directly to God, I am afraid, lest I die, and lest my wives and children also die. This is the threat that he sees, and he feels inwardly this fear. As he approaches Esau, he sends forward droves of gifts, presumably to placate Esau, to get again into his good graces, so that the threat will dissolve. And the night before he meets Esau, when he has come virtually all of the way, we are told that he arose that night and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of Jabbok. He took them and crossed over the brook and sent over what he had. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Now when he saw he did not prevail against him, the man touched the socket of Jacob's hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was dislocated as he wrestled with him. Then the man said, let me go, for the day breaks. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And so he said to Jacob, what is your name? And he said, I am Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have prevailed with God and men. Then Jacob asked, saying, tell me your name, I pray. And the man said, why do you ask about my name? And the man blessed Jacob there. So Jacob called the name of that place the Form of God, for I saw God face to face, and my soul was saved. Jacob has wrestled with God and with men and has prevailed. What does this mean? What exactly has he done? What does the story tell us about what this means? First, he has prevailed with men, meaning that he has come out prosperous from his time with Laban. That though Laban mistreated him, Jacob came out with many flocks. He came out with 2 companies. He says, I crossed over with my staff. I come back 20 years later with 2 companies. He comes back with great wealth and with offspring. And so his prevailing is material. His prevailing is material, if nothing else. It at least has to do with his well-being. But for him to prevail with God, what does this mean? It means that he has endured faithfully the trials and afflictions, the difficulties that God had ordained for him. God's hand has been over him his entire life. God's hand has been over him from when Esau swore his birthright and from when he received the blessing from Isaac, through the 20 years with Laban and the escape from the threat of Laban that just recently happened, all the way to this moment. And through the difficulties and trials involved, Jacob has maintained his faithfulness. He has maintained the disposition that God saw in him when he was in the womb, and when God promised that the elder would serve the younger. So God sends these humiliations, these difficulties, these afflictions, and he tests us. Shall we pass the test and cling to God, whatever our afflictions and difficulties may be, or will they overcome us? Jacob has wrestled and prevailed, because in his faith, he goes even to meet his brother that he fears. God has said, I will bring you back to this land, and I will be with you. And Esau comes with 400 men. And Jacob wrestles with God. Shall he believe in spite of the difficulty, and in the face of the difficulty that apparently comes to meet him? But he perseveres, and he goes to meet Esau. Chapter 33. Now Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau his brother was coming, and 400 men along with him. So Jacob bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. And so instead of a threat, instead of a sword or a spear, or anguish and death, the death of the wives and the children, instead you have reconciliation, you have peace, you have even joy at brothers coming to be together once again. And Jacob says to Esau, if I have now found grace in your sight, receive the presents from my hands, inasmuch as I have seen your face as though someone might see the face of God, and you were pleased with me. Receive my blessing I brought you, because God has shown me mercy, and I have enough. Thus he urged Esau, and Esau took it. And so the two of them are on very good terms. And rather than the threat of death, there is the promise of life. And Jacob, as he returns safely to the land, he comes to Salem, a city of Shechem, in the land of Canaan, and he takes a position in front of the city. He then bought a parcel of land where he pitched his tent from Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 male lambs, and there he set up an altar and called on the God of Israel. So he returns to the land, passing through these two threats, the threat from Laban and the threat from Esau. The threat from Laban, who had already treated him unjustly. The threat from Esau, who 20 years earlier had said explicitly that he meant to kill him when the opportunity arose. And he settles in the land peaceably. Chapter 35. Now God said to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods among you, purify yourselves, and change your garments. Let us arise and go up to Bethel and make an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my tribulation, and was with me, and saved me on the road that I traveled. What has God done again for Jacob? He was with him in the day of his tribulation throughout all of the afflictions he suffered, who answered him when he prayed, when he came before God, and who saved him on the road that he traveled. Now Jacob came to Luz, that is, Bethel, in the land of Canaan, and all the people with him. He built an altar there and called the place Bethel, because there God appeared to him when he fled the face of his brother Esau, and this is a reference back to the ladder. Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Mesopotamia and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. Your name shall not any more be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. And God also said to him, I am your God. Increase and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land I gave Abraham and Isaac I give to you, and to your seed after you I give this land. And Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke with him Bethel. So here at the end, after Jacob has returned, he is told to go and make an altar where he had the dream of the ladder. And there again, God gives him the covenant promise, I will give you offspring, and I will give you this land. So as he fled, he had this promise. And now that he has returned, he has the same promise. Now, this concludes the story of Jacob for us at this point. I just want to recap the lessons that I think are most relevant for us here. To go back to Isaac, what do we learn of Isaac? Isaac is a man of prayer. Isaac is a man of meditation. He seeks the presence of God. And this seeking of the presence of God, we are behooved to do even now in the modern time. Whatever the circumstances in our personal life or in our broader society, we must find a way to be in God's presence as much as we are able to do so, as much as it is afforded to us. And strikingly, we see Isaac in the evening meditating. And we are told by St. Joseph the Hesychast, find your time to pray, preferably in the evening. Not so different, we might say, from the example given to us by Isaac. What then do we learn from Jacob, who wrestled with God and who prevailed with God and men? We understand the patience of enduring affliction. In his case, 20 years, being removed from his homeland, to be under a man who mistreated him, who would not pay him honestly, for 2 decades worth of time, a long time to spend with this kind of deprivation, not trusting the one who is above you, having to work around him in order to gain any kind of prosperity. And we see prevailing with God as obeying God's commandments in faith, even when this appears to put one at risk. When God says, go back to the land, face your brother Esau. And Jacob does this out of obedience. We see that God is with these, that he's with Isaac, and he is with Jacob. And this is said over and over. But we know also that the name of the Savior is Emmanuel, God with us. And so we think of our faith in Christ. Who is it that we have faith in? We have faith in the one who is with us, who is, if we turn to him, arguably as near to us as God was with Isaac and with Jacob, that if we turn to him, he yearns to be present with us. And his name, through the Savior, again, is God with us. We will pick up next time with the story of Joseph. I will see you all then.
The Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua with Dr. Daniel Cantey. Dr. Cantey taught religion and philosophy at Bethel University from 2012 to 2019. He is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and Emory University and lives with his family in Clarksville, Tennessee. This has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.